And that's a critical aspect of what functional medicine is doing, because it's not just trying to take, oh, let me just take fish and throw it at this. Oh, let me take, B vitamins and throw it at this, or magnesium, but rather let's really understand what's happening with the individual, what the triggers are and where the imbalances are, and treat them in that way.
Welcome, everyone. We have a special guest here today, Dr. Hanaway, Hanaway in chat if you want to see more about him. He's an MD, served on many prestigious boards. He is the Chief Medical Education Officer at the Institute of Functional Medicine, IFM. He's paved the way for functional medicine collaboration with the Cleveland Clinic, and he's done a lot more. You can just look him up on ifm.org. Dr. Patrick Hanaway, or just Google Dr. Patrick Hanaway. I think the first link is the ifm.org link. So he's done a lot of stuff with functional medicine. Really excited to have him here. And just a quick overview on how the flow of this is going to be. We're going to do a lot of interview style, podcast style discussion with me and Dr. Hanaway. And then we are going to intermittently open up for some Q&A in chat. So if you're in chat and you have questions, I will announce when we're going to do a Q&A session, probably once every like 45 minutes. We'll grab a couple of questions at that time. So don't queue it up now, because I'm just going to blow away all the questions. We'll open up the queue occasionally, and then I'll grab a couple, we'll ask it, and then we'll resume some of the discussion. And some of the topics we're talking about today, you can see in the chat down below about what introduction to functional medicine, tracking our rest, our gut health, our poop, nutrition, and kids nutrition, and also some other, Q&A. We'll see what comes up. So Dr. Hanaway, it is an absolute honor to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks so much. This is my first Twitch. So I'm looking forward to being able to engage and talk with your audience and your followers, and looking forward to the kinds of exploratory questions we'll get into over the next couple hours.
All right, so we are back. We had to do some quick troubleshooting on stream, but we are ready to get started. And one of my first questions for you, Dr. Hanaway, is about functional medicine. So for those who don't know what functional medicine is, are you able to give a quick overview, and in particular to explain the differences between integrative versus functional versus alternative versus complementary? Because a lot of times these terms get kind of conflated with each other.
Sure, absolutely. So functional medicine is a systems biology view, systems medicine. So we're taking a systems lens, looking at the interrelationship, what's going on. In the process of doing that, we're listening to the person's individual story, being able to hear what the elements are, and then being able to personalize treatment. Now that all sounds good. Everyone's like, oh yeah, I'll have some of that. That's a great idea. So how does that differ from integrative medicine? The difference there is going to be that with functional medicine, it's an operating system. It's a way of thinking about a problem. Whereas integrative medicine is going to be focused more on a grab bag of different kinds of therapeutics. Oh, you've got problems, let's give you a probiotic. Oh, you have, energy problems, let's give you a B vitamin. And so it's more reflexive and doesn't really have an operating system. Now, if we look at things like traditional Chinese medicine or Ayurvedic medicine or Tibetan medicine, all of those have an operating system to think through problems. And that's what we do with medicine. So it integrates a lot of the different kinds of therapeutic approaches, and whether it's going to be around acupuncture or herbs or nutraceuticals or botanicals or food. And we take a food first approach when we're doing this, because we find that so much can be helped with nutrition. Now, complementary medicine is just saying that which is complementary to the standard allopathic Western medicine that is going on. Side note here, in our studies that we've done at the Cleveland Clinic looking at functional medicine, compared to standard of care, it's standard of care or standard of care plus functional medicine, being able to demonstrate an improvement. So we include good medicine as part of what we do. It's not other than, but it's including, kind of all the benefits of Western medicine, and then adding to it with a view that allows us to deal with complex chronic diseases and right now we see more than 100 million Americans, fit that bill of complex chronic disease. And so they need some help over and above just hypertensives, lipid lowering, antibiotics, antidepressants. Most of those kinds of therapies are focused on suppressing symptoms rather than getting to the root cause. So the metaphor that I use a lot with patients is to say, look at a tree. And if we see that there's something going on with one of the branches or limbs of the tree, which would be equivalent to like a branch of medicine, neurology, gastroenterology, psychiatry, the goal is not to suppress what's happening there, but rather go down to the roots of the tree. And those roots, which are going to be our modifiable lifestyle factors, are nutrition, exercise and movement, sleep, and rest, how we deal with stressors, what meaning and purpose is in our life. We're focusing there. And we're also focusing on the soil. Does the soil have toxins in it? Does the soil have hidden foods in it? Does the soil have allergens in it? What are those things that might be extrinsic from me that are causing imbalances? And what are the things that I'm doing that are causing imbalances? So that's sort of a first pass at it, and we can get into many details because then we look at these different functions. The term functional medicine goes to the consideration of there are simple functions that happen in our bodies, in each organ, in each cell, in our families, in our communities. And so those functions would be saying, how do I get the food and nutrients that I need? Light, love, macronutrients, micronutrients. How do I get them? How do I bring them in? Oxygen. Well, how do I get rid of that which I don't need? Elimination and biotransformation. How do I have a mechanism of defense and repair, whether we call it the immune system or the police force or the military? How do I work with being able to produce energy? Through mitochondria, focusing on energy production. How do I have aspects of transportation and communication and infrastructure? So those are the functions. And that's how when I see someone, I'm thinking about what's the root cause and what's happening with the functioning going on in their body, which is a little different than the way I was taught in medical school, where I focused on an organ system. Oh, is it the heart? Is it the lungs? Is it the brain? Actually, it's the whole person. And so I'm looking at the whole person.
Yeah, I really like that systems approach and how everything is just interconnected because just a quick story of my own. I have ankylosing spondylitis, diagnosed with it, and could not get a good answer for why this is happening, but researched a little bit into it in the functional medicine approach, cut out gluten. And I'm really summarizing it, but basically saw a really strong correlation with my AS symptoms and gluten. And I told my rheumatologist about this, and she was almost in disbelief that diet, something in the gut could lead to something like a systemic inflammation. And so like that speaks to your point about just how a lot of traditional doctors have kind of split apart the systems into as if they don't work together. But I like that approach of the functional medicine approach. Obviously I'm biased team functional medicine here, but my question though is all of this sounds.
Can I speak? to that?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Just a second before you go. I want to say it's fascinating to me because I can go back 30 to 40 years and show the papers in the peer-reviewed research in gastroenterology that says, oh, ankylosing spondylitis happens with people who have a particular genetic predisposition. It's called HLA-B27, which we can test and measure for. And it's when their guts have an imbalance of a gut microbiota, called Klebsiella. And when that Klebsiella actually goes through a leaky gut, and the antibodies, but the immune system says, hey, you're not supposed to be here. And it creates an antibody. Well, that antibody to that particular bacteria is looks just like the antibody that would be made to the components of the connective tissue in the lower back, in the sacrum, and causing Ankylosing spondylitis. Like, that's not even new research. That's been done 30. So to say, oh, we don't, how could it? Well, the food determines what's going to happen with your gut microbiome, and the food and stress and other things determine happen with your permeability. And those are things we can do something about. Can't do anything about predisposition. We can search the other things instead of just saying, oh, you should be on a biologic for the rest of your life. That might have some long-term side effects, and it's pretty expensive.
Yeah. Um, the the functional medicine approach is, it sounds so good in theory, and for those who don't deal with chronic inflammation, they may be skeptical about this because they never had a need for functional medicine. And so a lot of skeptics out there, they view like alternative medicine, complementary medicine, they hear functional medicine, they group it together, they hear quackery, and they're very skeptical of it. And so I'm curious on your perspective in terms of, obviously in every profession, there's people who are good at what they do and there's people who are bad at what they do. In your mind, for functional medicine, if we're shopping for a functional medicine doctor, are there certain red flags that we should watch out for? Is there reason to be skeptical?
Yeah, as you said, in every profession, there's people who are really good at what they do, and there's people who overstate what they can do. I think if you've got someone who guarantees that you're going to get better, that's a red flag right there. If you've got someone who says with certainty that this one thing, heavy metal toxins, mold toxins, gluten, one thing is the answer, then it's like, I'm not so sure that I'm going to work with that person, because they've got it's a one trick pony. And, that trick may work at the time on some of the people, but, we're all different and we're unique. And it's, someone who's going to take the time and listen to the story. So what we've done is through the Institute for Functional Medicine, where actually I was the chief medical education officer. Now I'm a senior advisor to the CEO. But what we've done is created a curriculum that people go through, and a certification process where we test them and making sure they understand. So, looking for what is called an IFM certified practitioner, someone, they've got experience, they've got the curriculum, they've gone through it. And that's kind of the true functional medicine. And there's people who don't have that training, but who are really good and know what they're talking about. So you can find some people outside of that domain who've got a lot of experience over a long period of time, but that's a simple first pass that you can do to say, like, okay, well, this person's certified. And, for people who are interested, ifm.org, find a practitioner. You can find someone in your area. We've got about 1,500 people trained, 1,800 people trained, and another couple thousand in the queue right now.
So one of the things that I wanted to ask you, because I know you have a history working with Genova. Genova, for those who don't know, they do a lot of testing. Know a lot of functional medicine doctors do some specialty testing through them. Would you consider a red flag if they are doing or pushing a lot of testing up front, expensive testing?
That's an interesting question, because my experience, and so if you talk to doctors over time, when we're early on in our learning curve, we tend to do a lot more testing, try to understand what's going on. Whereas later in our learning curve, we're like, oh, I have a pretty good idea of what's happening. And so, like in my case, I don't do a lot of testing right up front when I see people. I spend a couple hours, I listen to their story and have a pretty good idea of where to go. And it's only when things aren't going in the way that I expect they will that I do testing. But I know that early on in my career, I did a lot more testing because I was trying to understand what was going on. And so some people will take more of a shotgun approach, and other people will take more of a rifle approach. Mine is more of a rifle approach, of trying to figure out exactly what's going on, rather than trying to, and I hate to use war and gun metaphors. I guess that's not, should check that. But
Go for it.
I think that there are some people who have a package, and it's like they're going to give this package to everybody. And I don't find that people fit in packages. I think that every package is unique and different, and I want to listen and hear the story. So if I get someone coming to me with depression, it can be related to heavy metals. It can be related to proton pump inhibitors. It can be related to an inflammatory diet. It can be related to, what else will we have there? An alteration in the gut microbiome. It can be a pro-inflammatory diet. There's lots of different things. I'm not going to take a one-size-fits-all approach. I'm going to listen to their story and say, I think this is related to, and I'm usually going to take a food-first approach. For instance, I found this in practice, it's like if I'm working with somebody and I feel like the diet is the single most important thing, why would I do a bunch of testing before I change their diet to something that's really going to work? And if I put them on a better diet and then I see where things are at, that's useful. But if I do a bunch of testing right up front and I'm changing your diet, by the time I get the results back, everything's already changed. So whether it's in your gut microbiome or in nutritional testing or inflammation. So I like to keep the ball rolling first with helping a person to understand, well, what food and how do I eat that? And we talked about this, I'm sure we'll dive into it. And it's not about being 100% perfect 100% of the time, because it's just not possible.
Yeah.
So it's like, let's do our best with bringing in a good diet, and let's understand where the triggers really are.
Yeah, I like that, because we can look for low-hanging fruit up front, stuff that's relatively accessible for lifestyle changes and cheap. Because if you cut out certain foods, like in my case, cutting out gluten and then carefully, tracking that myself. I was tracking, okay, I'm going to have no gluten for these days. I'm going to just gorge on gluten and then see how I feel and all that kind of stuff. That to me was pretty low effort and sustainable, because right now I'm on a pretty gluten light diet where day to day I don't consume large amounts of gluten. Occasionally I'll have some if we're like doing pizza or whatever. But one of the things I want to ask about is about tracking. And for the average person, how do we know if we're on track? And one of the things that I hear so much about, but I've never heard it well defined, is the sympathetic versus parasympathetic states. And I'll try to define it for my understanding of it. Feel free to correct me. But the sympathetic basically being fight or flight, or we're active, we're on, we're going to go, versus parasympathetic, rest and digest, let's recover. So play hard, work hard, rest hard. That kind of, that's my a view of it. And my question for you, could you tell us, like, how do we know what state we're in? How do we balance it? How do we optimize being in each state?
So there's a lot of questions.
Oh yeah, there's a lot to
there.
unpack.
So the end question, the end question on the parasympathetic sympathetic, we'll go there. But I do want to come back and be able to talk about, well, how do you track? How do you understand where you're at? And how do you determine, like, going into initially with a more aggressive kind of dietary approach, like being gluten-free. And then you find over time that as you improve your reserve and increase your resilience, you're actually able to tolerate some gluten some of the time, and it's not an issue.
Same with me.
But then if you fall back to, like, eating a ton of gluten and not really paying attention, all of a sudden or slowly those symptoms will come back. And so what that answer is, but how do you monitor yourself? So we'll talk about that. But let's come to the fight or flight response and parasympathetic sympathetic tone. You and I talked about this a little bit previously, and that is, I'm more data driven in my approach, and that being able to really understand where a person is at. When I meet someone, I can kind of feel where the person, they're like over the top, they're wired and they're amped, and there are ways to be able to look at and seeing that using cortisol awakening response and things of that nature, looking at salivary cortisol, which are great tools that have been around in the field of psychoneuroimmunology for over 40 years, well researched, well understood. And then there's some people who just have, they're agitated, but they've got no energy at all. I'm going to work with those patients in different ways. Now that's telling me about what's happening in their hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and what's going on in terms of overall energy production. And many times it's the brain saying, slow down. You need to slow down. You're pushing too hard. So there's that aspect of it. And then there's the aspect that, as you talked about, which is the sympathetic, parasympathetic tone. So sympathetic, being that, epinephrine, norepinephrine, fight or flight. And that's what happens. So when there's a saber-toothed tiger at the door, then our body produces adrenaline, epinephrine, in order to be able to have sugar be moving out from the gut out into the periphery, into the muscles, so that we can fight or run and everything we can. There's a decrease in the immune system, and that's all mediated also through a cortisol, an acute cortisol response. Now, in the setting where we're in traffic and there's accidents and there's sort of stress like coming, and if we relate to it from a sense of a hyperactive fight or flight response, then we're going to be in a chronic phase of imbalance, of chronic sympathetic overdrive. And that culturally is an issue. But the answer is not to try to be in the rest and relaxation response all the time. In fact, we want to be able to have the fight or flight response, because that's what actually tonifies our system. That's what helps to induce, positive athletic performance and being able to achieve things that we couldn't previously achieve. You see people in particular cases of stress doing things that are like superhuman. It's giving us that property. So we want to have a balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic. That's really a necessary thing. So then how do you tell where that is? Well, what I've done over time is I've used a tool called heart rate variability, HRV. And there's different kinds of tools for HRV that one can measure. First, I'll explain it, and then I'll talk about a couple different tools that I use. So heart rate variability is looking at the beat to beat variability. How much distance is there in between each heartbeat? Now you think, well, isn't it regular? Like if my heart rate's 48 or 61, then it's regular. That's what it is. But what we see is that there is a variance in between each heartbeat. And so if there's a lot of variance, like a spaciousness, that's good. That indicates that there's more parasympathetic tone, rest and response. If it's really tight, that means you're in sympathetic overdrive. So think like rigidity versus spaciousness. Well, what you want is, you want some spaciousness, but, as Groucho said, be open-minded, but not so open-minded that your brains fall out. You want to be able to have some spaciousness there, but it's not like I'm just chill all the time and I'm never doing anything. So it's a balance between these two. And that balance is called coherence. So when you're coherent, you got a really good ability to move into a stress response when you need to, and a chill response on the other side. That's good. That's what optimal is. That's coherent. And we find that the people who have the highest coherence, the best balance between these two, are the people who live the longest, have the best immune systems, don't have diabetes, don't have the same degree of complex chronic disease. And in fact, if they have those things and they learn tools of coherence, they actually improve the outcomes of all those things. So that's pretty cool. Then you say, well, how do I know if I'm balanced? I had patients who think because they sit down and they turn on Netflix and they watch, a TV show or a football game, that they're actually moving into a rest and response, a rest and relaxation response. But, I've watched people watch different TV shows and football games and basketball games, and they're not actually chilling. They're pretty
They're
amped
getting
up.
really into it.
So, Right. And it's not actually the rest. So what are the tools that are used? And so I'll offer four that I've used sort of in the air in the order that I've learned about them and they've developed. The first one has been around for a long time. It's called Heart Math. And Heart Math, a little monitor that you clip on your ear, it measures your heart rate.
Heart
And you can
math,
do
you
that
said?
to
Sorry to
do
interrupt.
heart math, just like
Math, like
mathematics.
okay,
Heart
arithmetic, that kind of
math.
stuff. Okay, heart math.
Right. Heart math. And they've been doing research for like 40 years on this stuff. Great work, really helped to bring it to the fore. And their specific tool is one that allows you to do the biofeedback. It's like, okay, I'm amped up right now, and I'm going to spend 5 minutes and I'm going to move into a place of coherence and balancing. And so it's an actual biofeedback tool, which is great. And one of the things I like about it is it's sort of non-denominational. You know, I say it like this, like, well, you say, well, how do I get there? Well, you go to like your favorite place. You go to your safe place. You go to your, you know, your special place. And it varies from person to person. One person can go to the ocean and feel relaxed. Another person can feel fear. One person can think about their mom and it's like, you know, the greatest thing in the world. Another person thinks about their mom and they're like super stressed. So you find a thing that works for you and you go and you just do some breathing exercises to be able to follow that. So that's heart math, and that's a biofeedback tool, but that's not telling you about real time what's going on. So now over the past 5 years, there have been a series of tools that have been developed that are working to say, well, where am I at right now? And how do I determine what things in my life are stressors and what things are helping me to be able to relax? And you know, it also has been used in performance to be able to determine where am I at in that rest and recovery phase. Do I need to slow down my workouts today, or do I have the capacity to really be able to push myself, you know, to new maxes and limits and things of that nature? So the tools that I like are, one is this ring that I have right here, this Aura ring, and you can kind of see on the inside of it there's little uh,
Sensors.
monitors, little probes, little sensors. Thank you, that are looking at my beat to beat variability of my heart rate. It monitors my sleep. There's other tools that aren't quite as good at this. That, you know, like say an Apple Watch or a Fitbit are not actually looking at the beat to beat variability. Aura is. Whoop does a little bit of it, but not nearly as well as Aura does. And so it gives me a sense of where I'm at overall, and I can plot, you know, day to day, week to week, you know, see how I'm doing overall, and monitors my sleep and monitors exercise. It's not as great a tool of monitoring exercise as, let's say, a Whoop or a Fitbit is. But it's something that's, you know, I don't have to think about it. It's just on my hand, and, you know, I charge it every 3 or 4 days, and it gives me data and helps me to understand. So that's one tool. Another tool is something called HRV for training, you know, which just basically is an app on your phone for $7, and you put your finger over the camera and it tells you where you're at. And so for people, for your, you know, followers who are interested in the concept, it's like, well, that's a pretty simple entry in to say, is there something there? Then there's other tools, and one that I have been talking to. They're based in Asheville, North Carolina. I guess I'd say that's where I am. And it's called Elite HRV. And they've been working with elite athletes around the world for about 3 years and are developing some cool new technology as well. Right now, they have a sensor that you put on your finger that you can use first thing in the morning or before and after workouts to be able to see, how am I doing? You know, how much can I push myself at this point in time? And they've got a lot of great science in what they're doing. So these are, and I'm sure there's more tools out there that I'm not aware of, but these are some that help me to measure. And so I do it for myself. I recommend it to patients. I review the data with them. I go over, how do we move into a more balanced state, and give them oftentimes, breathing exercises, or some physical exercises to be able to help them to be able to deepen into coherence, that term coherence that I used.
So let me see if I understand. Let's go through a hypothetical example. Let's just say I'm listening to this. I don't have the best lifestyle right now. I feel stressed. I want to try to make some changes. I want to try to do meditation. I want to try to get out more, whatever that is, try to relax more, whatever that is for that person. They would get one of these apps or one of these things to check heart rate variability, Oura Ring, whatever those are. They would try get a baseline for what their beat to beat looks like, then try these techniques like meditation, get out more, and then see if that improves. It just kind of track the data and see what's working, what's not working. Is that how you envision the average person would improve their?
Well, sorry. That's one way to do it. Another way is to be very specific and volitional. It's like, okay, I'm gonna go into a training where I'm gonna work to be able to deepen my heart rate variability. I'm going to start measuring it, and then I'm going to be able to do some specific breathing exercise each morning to help me, or I'm going to do yoga, or I'm going to go for a walk in nature, or I'm going to, some intervention that's in mind, and then see, okay, how is this working for me? So I'm going to give a personal example that happened for me that kind of surprised me. So a couple of years ago, I was sick. I'll spill it. So I was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. I was getting chemotherapy, radiation therapy, following nutrition, resting, doing all the right things, acupuncture. And I was tired. I wasn't getting outside. It was in the wintertime. And I realized I just got to get outside. And I was looking at my heart rate variability on my Oura Ring, and it wasn't very good. Of course, I was going through, daily radiation therapy, and, it's kind of in a tough spot. Side note, or, spoiler alert, no evidence of disease on a PET scan last week, 2 years out. So I'm doing well at this point in time. Thank you. But what I wanted to highlight was that I started going out into doing just kind of walking in nature and playing, not to get exercise, but just because I had to get outside. And what happened was I started noticing, oh my gosh, my heart rate variability has doubled in the past 2 weeks since I started doing that. It just started, that was the only change that was going on. I was like, that's amazing that for me, that spending time in nature was that helpful for me to be able to do. And I've stopped that and started it again, kind of an N of one experiment. And I've seen when I stop it, the heart rate variability goes back down, all other things stay the same. And then when I start it back up again, the heart rate variability goes up, it improves. So it's like, okay, there's something important here for me. You can go into, there's a ton of research on what's called Shinrin-yoku, or forest bathing for the Japanese, and anti-cancer effects, immune stimulating effects. There's some great data on that. But for me, what it helped out was in relationship to a increased parasympathetic tone and better heart rate variability coherence. And again, I'm not saying that's the answer for everybody. That's the experiment. That's the N of one experiment that I did that said, okay, this is what works for me. Because I was already doing meditation. I was already doing, some movement. I was getting good sleep. I was having a good ketogenic dietary program and monitoring my microbiome. And I would look at a lot of different things, and they were all, doing pretty well, but I wasn't doing well. So it's just an example of, inviting the followers, the people out there to say, try it yourself. And like I said, something like an Elite HRV app or the HRV for training are things that you can get on your smartphone, and you can start playing with it yourself without having to buy a, $300 ring.
One thing I'm curious about is when I think of doing cardio, I think of improving my heart rate. I think of improving my heart rate variability. I was wondering if is there much overlap between someone who just trains and does more cardio with some of the things that you've been talking about.
Well, I think my view on the training side, and we can get into this, is that it's a balance. It's not about all cardio. There's the value of high intensity interval training, but not doing too much of it. You have patient people who come in and it's like, I'm doing it every day. It's like, no, I don't want to be doing HIIT every day, and the importance of strength training and resistance training in addition to cardio. It's the whole package of things that goes on there. So what we can do is we can find, are you overdoing it? And that's one of the things, like the data scientists at Elite HRV, looking at and working with Olympic athletes, to be able to say, there are days where you need to cut back on what your training is. And there are days that you can really push it to the edge and be able to see what your limits are. Because as we know, it's like, as we push that limit and we get to a new bar, then the next time we're in that optimal state, we can push that even further. We can continue on our improvement overall. And I think that's, from my perspective, that's how we work to optimize our health and well-being. It's not about perfection. It's about listening to the body, and when can I push it really hard, and when do I need to hold back? And I'm sure, because it's happened to you, it's happened to me. There are days where intellectually I'm going for it, and I push myself past the limit, and I'm wiped out, sometimes wiped out for several days. It's like, oh God, I just really overdid it. And if I'm listening to my body, it's giving me cues. And if I'm watching my HRV, it's giving me cues about when I'm ready to optimize and when I need to rest.
So I'm curious, besides the heart rate stuff, what are some example cues that someone should be watching out for? Like they just feel stressed, they feel wiped out. Let's use myself as an example, because I'm gonna be selfish and just get your opinion. I'm a go kind of guy. I'm productive. I feel like I can flip the switch and just be like, all right, it's because I'm working like 2 jobs, got the kids, doing childcare for them. In the morning, I wake up, I feel rested and ready to wake up, and I just like, all right, let's go work out. I do my exercise, do my fitness streams. I gotta, got my day job. And then afterward, I take care of the kids. I gotta be on, because I'm basically single parent because of COVID. My wife and I alternate single parents. So now I'm single dad, from like afternoon till bedtime. And then I'm doing dinner. I have to focus on them. And then we go out and play, bathe them, dinner time, all that stuff. And then it's around 9 p.m. I'm like, all right, I just go to bed when they go to bed, because I'm doing the relaxation. The last 2 hours before bed, I'm doing the kind of anyway, to a degree, the relaxation of like, it's getting dark, we dim the lights, we do bedtime stories. And so I get tired and sleepy, and I don't feel wiped out when I go to bed, but I feel ready for bed. And so that's kind of like my day-to-day routine. I'm wondering, for someone like me, I don't feel stressed. I just feel like I'm on most of the day, and then I'm just, all right, I'm off. And then just time to just turn the lights out and just pass out, that kind of stuff. So what are some signs for like a type A personality like me that, I should be watching out for? Maybe I'm fooling myself that I'm really actually stressed all the time. I just don't realize it. What do you think?
Well, one of the things is you're young and healthy, and so you've got more reserve. And what you really want to be paying attention to is looking at that, because am I overdoing it? Ways to look at, am I overdoing it, is that, in the morning when you get up, are you rocketing right away, where your what's called your cortisol awakening response is like through the roof. You want to have an increase, but you don't want to be like, hitting the ground running as soon as your feet hit the ground in the morning. It's like, okay, so how do I move into a balance where I'm ramping up? And one of the ways you can tell about that is, at the end of the day, where am I at in the cool down? Am I pushing right to the end, and then I hit the bed and I'm out? It's the so-called sleep latency is one where, like, if you're falling asleep within 1 or 2 minutes of laying down, it means you're exhausted. Now what you're talking about is like, no, you're actually, chilling down, you're reading a story, you're with the kids, and so then the question becomes, what's it like on the days or nights when you're not with the kids? What's happening? Are you pushing right up to the end and then exhausted stopping? Or are you actually, ratcheting down and not having a lot of screen stimuli and a lot of engagement with the world, but you're really, starting to chill and then you go to bed? That's great. And the fact that you wake up rested, that's a good sign. And so you're probably in a pretty good state. And you could look at, what's happening either with HRV when you get up in the morning. That's going to tell you about day-to-day variations. The cortisol awakening response, which is a salivary test that can be done, where you wake up in the morning and you spit in a tube, and a half hour later you spit in a tube, and an hour after you wake up you spit in a tube. And that's going to tell you, okay, where are you at in that curve? You want to be ramping up, but you don't want to be skyrocketing. And it ramps up and then it comes down over the course of the day. That's the normal thing that you should see. And you could look at that, cortisol response, or what's called the diurnal variation. Diurnal meaning throughout the day, variation in your cortisol. And that can be done through a salivary test. Pretty simple, about $150. I use that more for helping people to see where they're at, because I think when I meet people, I can pretty much say, like, you're overamped, or you're wiped out, or probably not an issue going on for you when I'm sitting and talking with them. And we've spent some time talking, and I'd say there's a little risk that you're on the overamped side on the beginning of it, but there's a lot of other signs that, because of the way in which you're working with your health and well-being, that you're doing well and that you have reserves. What you want to be sure of is that you're not spending those reserves, unnecessarily. Does that answer your question? Does that help?
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. That's where I feel like I ride that edge of overproductive, definitely amped up, because just the way life is right now, I have to there's only so many hours in the day. And unfortunately, an unfortunate reality I had to come to terms with is I really do need 7 to 9 hours of sleep, closer to 9 hours of sleep every night, to feel like my best. I had a long story about going on TRT and just my testosterone was really shot. And then at the end of the day, the TRT didn't really do much. It didn't change much for me in terms of how I felt. It changed my testosterone numbers to normal, but I didn't feel really better. Downstairs felt better, but that's not really like, to me, it was treating more the symptom. The one absolute that's really made the difference is forcing myself not just to get 7 hours of sleep, but like closer to 9, and just sleep early enough with good sleep hygiene, such that I give myself enough time to sleep. If I need to sleep 9 hours, I can, I do. And I've been feeling a lot better. That's probably like the single thing that's made a massive difference for me. And go ahead.
So let me just interrupt for a second, because I think it's, the way I think about that is that you start off with progesterone and pregnenolone over here. They come from cholesterol. Now they can either go to produce cortisol, or they can go across to produce the anabolic hormones, testosterone and DHEA. Now we can substitute the testosterone, and we can have some changes in our symptoms by substituting it. But ultimately, the data shows that if you're producing it yourself, you're going to be doing a lot better. And so by focusing on sleep for you, it's going to be different for different people, but for focusing on sleep for you, that helps to not be pushing into cortisol production. And so you have more endogenous testosterone production, which we find is what the big difference is overall. If we measure people with low DHEA and we just give them DHEA, or low testosterone, we just give them testosterone, they feel better for a period of time, up to 6 months, but there's no long-term benefit from doing that. But when you start producing it yourself, there's a long-term benefit from doing that. And for you, you figured out that, it's 9 hours of sleep. For some people, it's 8 hours of sleep. And many people, there's a minimum amount of sleep, and the data would tell us it's at least 7. And people who are getting under 7 hours of sleep who think they're okay, they're not.
Yeah.
The data shows it's the equivalent of like 2 alcohol drinks of impairment while you're driving, of having, chronic sleep deprivation.
Yep. Speaking of chronic sleep deprivation, it's one of those things where if you're in a hot, stuffy room that's enclosed and you've been in there for hours, you don't realize it's a hot, stuffy room. Like people say, that's hot and stuffy. Like, that's normal. But then you go out of the room, you get some fresh air, or basically you restore your sleep. And then you go back in, you're like, oh God, what was I thinking? Being in here, it's like so hot and stuffy. You don't realize it until you actually go out of it. So one of the things I do with my audience is people who I think are sleep deprived, I do like I encourage them to do a 30-day sleep challenge. Just 30 days, gorge on sleep, pay off that sleep debt, because it can take weeks to pay it off. And just try your best, absolute best sleep hygiene, cut out unnecessary entertainment for just 30 days. Just try to gorge on sleep and see if you notice anything different. And for me, that was, I would say, life-changing, to be honest. But I'm going to open it up for Q&A.
That's great. It shows you're listening to your body. And I appreciate that in the conversation, because you have ways that you're listening to what is my body needing. And you're paying attention to it. I think that's the key aspect in all of this.
Completely agree. Like, just track it, test it. Let's be scientists about this. Let's take a look. Is this making a difference? We're going to open it up for some quick Q&A. We're going to take a question or two. Go ahead and queue it up right now. I'll pick a question or two to take. !Q, type out your question. My bot will grab it. I had one more selfish question to ask about the rest and digest, parasympathetic, sympathetic state stuff. I have heard two things. One is that rest and digest, right? We should be relaxing, all that kind of stuff. Rest, digest. But at the same time, I've also heard you should not eat and then go take a nap. You should not, it's bad for digestion to eat and then immediately sleep. I've heard of these two things. I've never heard anyone take these two concepts and kind of like clear up this, where's the nuance here? Is there any nuance that you could help me understand?
Well, first I'm going to, talk a little bit about what that means to rest and digest, and it's slowing down to be able to allow that parasympathetic tone. Parasympathetic tone increases, so the vagus nerve, not the Las Vegas nerve, the vagus nerve, which is the wandering nerve that comes down, and it affects our heart rate, it affects our respiratory rate, but it also affects our gut. It affects our gut in three principal ways. The first one is around producing acid, so that the stomach is actually able to break down proteins effectively. The acid environment allows for the proteins that we eat to be broken down, whether they're animal, vegetable proteins, doesn't matter, that it's necessary to do that. So acid production in the stomach is this first part. Next part, in terms of digestion, is that it stimulates the pancreas and the gallbladder to release the enzymes and the bile. There are enzymes that break down carbs called amylases, that break down fats called lipases, and that break down proteins called proteases, released from the pancreas. Now, that can be altered if you've got some bad food allergies or inflammation going on, or if you're not in a parasympathetic tone, if you're not resting. And that's where the digestion comes from. So it stimulates those things. And the third aspect that the parasympathetic rest and digest comes from is it improves the gut motility. So things start moving through as you eat them. You're digesting them and moving them through. And I have patients who come in who have GERD or heartburn. I'm first thinking about, like, how are you eating? Are you resting? Are you slowing down? Or are you eating on the fly? And are you eating in front of a screen? Or are you, eating at business meetings? Those things are not those are going to keep you in sympathetic tone and are not going to allow the digestion and motility to occur. So that's the first step. And that's pretty clear and easy. Then there's the piece that, we were taught when we were little kids. Okay, you don't want to go do exercise. You don't want to go swimming right after you had lunch. You got to wait an hour. And that's because, we are moving all of our resources into the gut to allow for that digestion and assimilation of nutrients to be able to occur. So we don't have as much outflow into our skeletal muscle to be able to activate. So we don't want to do that. But there is a balance point, because what we find that when we go into eating and then taking a nap immediately thereafter, that is one that doesn't allow us to be able to assimilate, especially the proteins, in an effective way. We're ingesting something, but now we need to begin to incorporate them. And if we're not doing that, that's why taking a walk or doing something in that nature, which is still relaxing, is the best thing to be able to do rather than simply taking a nap. That said, taking a nap is probably better than going out and, doing some HIIT exercise or being overly active right after eating. So there's a continuum there.
Okay, that's good to know. That actually answers it perfectly. Thank you. So one of our questions, speaking of GERD, Judge 80 asks, is GERD reversible?
Absolutely. Now, GERD, so gastroesophageal reflux disease. Now, I love it. It's a disease. No, it's not actually a disease. It's sort of the way Western medicine labels a symptom as a disease. When you have heartburn, when you have reflux that's going on, it can relate to an inadequate closing of the gastroesophageal sphincter. Let me stand up here. So like it's right in that area. And that can stay open relatively from certain foods, sugars, chocolate. Those things are going to keep that not closing effectively. And so the acid that's in the stomach is going to just start spilling up into the swallowing tube, into the esophagus, and you're going to have symptoms of heartburn. Now, the answer is not take a proton pump inhibitor, a PPI, a purple pill, and, Nexium and Prilosec and those kinds of things, because that's just saying, okay, stop acid production. But you heard me say earlier, you need acid production to be able to activate the enzymes to break down protein. So symptomatically, we've got a tool that works. It stops the acid production and oftentimes, not always, oftentimes stops the symptoms, but it's not actually getting at the root of the problem. So when I'm looking at someone with GERD, I'm thinking about, okay, what's happening with the foods that you're eating? Are there specific foods that are causing problems? Some people will have issues with certain kinds of acidic foods or tomatoes or nightshade vegetables. Some people will have problems with those sweets and things like that that keep it open. Like, begin to identify what are the foods that I'm eating that actually tend to cause it to worsen. And you would work to eliminate those for a period of time, like about 3 to 4 weeks, and then add them back and see, is it still causing a problem? Now, where I focus is on that and the portion size. The portion size for Americans used to be an 8-inch plate. Now it's a 12-inch plate. And if you eat too much food, you're going to have problems being able to get it all mobilizing. But then that comes to that third part that I mentioned earlier, and that is about motility of the gut and how are things working. And are you in a state of parasympathetic tone that's allowing movement to be able to occur? Find a lot of times that people, especially the group of people who have reflux or heartburn and have constipation, like big red flag, motility issues, we've got to help get things moving through and get what's called the migratory motor complex. There's a different rhythm that the colon and the small intestine has. You got to get that working so that motility is happening in a good way. So the question is it reversible? Absolutely. Now, big caution for the people out there who are taking a proton pump inhibitor. Back when I was in medical school, we had the antihistamines and H2 blockers, Tagamet and stuff like that were early things that would be able to help with heartburn. But then they developed these proton pump inhibitors. The problem with the proton pump inhibitors is that they were approved for 12-week period of time. I got patients who've been on them for 20 years. So if
My dad
you're
too.
on something, if you're on something for that long and you're not producing acid, you're gonna have some downstream consequences because you're not breaking down your proteins, and that not breaking down of the proteins can lead to an increase in certain kinds of bacterial growth, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, so-called SIBO. I'm sure we'll have some questions that can happen from that proton pump inhibitor, because you're basically not breaking down the proteins, and so you're sending them downstream and you end up feeding the bacteria instead of feeding yourself. So the reason I'm perseverating on this for a moment is that because so there's a lot of good reasons why you don't want to be on that proton pump inhibitor, but when you stop, there is an automatic rebound of increased acid production. It's kind of like a devious thing from the drug manufacturers, and it's not their fault. It's just what happens with it. And so if you stop it cold turkey, your symptoms are going to get really bad the very next day. So you can't just stop turkey. Now, if you're taking it every once in a while, it's probably not going to be a problem. But if you're taking it every day and you've been taking it every day for 6 months or more, then you really need to do a taper on it. And that taper is a slow taper. I like have my patients taper over an 8-week period of time, doing some dietary change, looking at those kinds of nightshades, acidic foods, and the sweets that are causing problems, and slowly taper the dose of the proton pump inhibitor every 2 weeks. And I'm able to get people off, most of the time, and still not have GERD symptoms. And so is it reversible? Absolutely.
Okay, great answer. Thank you. You know, some people though, they're actually, one of my questions I want to ask about motivation. Some people may not be motivated to make these kinds of changes. They'd rather just take the pill. They're not motivated to make changes, dietary changes, because they want to enjoy their coffee or nightshades or alcohol or whatever it is that is actually, it might be contributing to the GERD. They don't want to change. They want to keep taking the pill. For people who need that motivation, how do you get through to them? Or is there is no getting through?
Well, one of the things when I was in medical school, I was really interested in prevention. And what I found is that most people don't want to do the positive things on prevention just be a good thing. They wait until they start having symptoms, and then they'll say, oh gosh, maybe I should do something about it. So this small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, IBS, other kinds of nutritional deficiencies can all occur from the proton pump inhibitors. And you may have to wait and just say, hey, there's some long-term consequences of this. And we can go into the gastroenterology peer-reviewed literature, and it's like, yeah, there's a lot of long-term consequences of this, so beware, and that's all you can do. That's all I can do is buyer beware. There's some things to look at. When you're ready, come on back. I can help you.
Yeah, there is no free lunch. The next question is from, and then we'll resume the discussion. Decipher Zero, diagnosed with severe obstructive sleep apnea last year. Before CPAP, I was having trouble losing weight, regardless of how much I worked out or my diet was. He's lost 40 pounds since being on a CPAP therapy. Congrats. Is it possible to eventually get to a point where I won't need the CPAP?
So yes, the answer is yes. I mean, we find this with almost any kind of chronic disease. The ability to be able to move back to health and well-being is there. Some of it depends upon how much damage has been done in the process. But the fact that, you've lost 40 pounds is great, because it's going to decrease some of the impact of what's going on in your neck area. But there are different kinds of sleep apnea. There's central obstructive sleep apnea, which is really happening in the brain, in the cortical regions. And then there are more structural obstructive sleep apnea things, including with the nasopharynx and the oropharynx, where things are closed down. So when we see people who are overweight or who are snoring, and I like to use a simple tool on the smartphone with my patients called Snorla, where it's a free app. It might be $4.
What's it called again?
Download it, and you just punch it. snore lab,
Nor
like
lab. Okay.
snoring,
Yep.
snore lab. And you just, punch it when you go to bed, and it starts recording if you're snoring. It waits for snoring, and then it starts recording it, and then it records it. And then you can see, is there any stopping of breathing that's happening that's associated with the snoring, which is obstructive sleep apnea. Now, what's happened with Zephyr and other people is that if you have obstructive sleep apnea, your oxygen levels in your brain are going down, and you have disrupted sleep. Now, we talked earlier about sleep, but when you have disrupted sleep, it causes an increase in inflammation and causes an increase in insulin resistance. So insulin resistance means that when the body's producing insulin, which is the key to help glucose enter into the cells, the body becomes resistant. It's like saying, hey, your key's not working. Your key's rusty. It's not opening the gates. And so the glucose, which is circulating, stays in the body, stays in the bloodstream. And, so that's kind of like a pre-diabetic state. Now we see increases that feeds further inflammation, that feeds hypertension, that feeds visceral weight gain, that feeds cardiovascular diseases, and a lot of other things. So the obstructive sleep apnea can be an entry point for worsening all of those things. And it's a feed forward process, because if you start being insulin resistant and you're gaining weight, even though you're eating the same kinds of foods, you're gaining more weight. And you're gaining more visceral fat, not just body fat, but visceral fat. Now you're entering into a much higher risk. So, working with the sleep app, using CPAP in this case, or frankly, whatever tool is going to help, is an important component to be able to do. And once you get down to not having that same degree of insulin resistance, you don't have that same degree of obstruction of sleep. Your sleep cycles are better. You're doing the things that you said in terms of being able to determine what are my actual sleep needs, and working with that. And then, of course, working with diet. Because if you're eating a standard American or basic American sad or bad diet that tends to be pro-inflammatory with, an egg muffin for breakfast and a Big Mac for lunch and a double Whopper with bacon for dinner, that's going to be pro-inflammatory. So you're going to have to work on that aspect of it as well. But the question was, can obstructive sleep apnea be reversed? Absolutely. And for many people, they need to use something like CPAP or something to help regulate it, to be the accelerator of going there. Not everyone needs that, but for some people, as we hear with Zephyr, with 40-pound weight loss, absolutely helpful, being a big trigger to be able to do that. And I'll just say as an aside, and be sure to clean your CPAP machine regularly.
I can imagine. All right, great, thank you. So let's get back to the other discussion topics today. I want to talk about gut health, poop health in particular. We hear people talk about poop and just gut health, that it should be good. But with the avoiding expensive testing, assuming we don't have all the money in the world, I'm just curious, what are some good heuristics or rules of thumb to know that we're on the right track or wrong track? Is there something in our poop that we should just look for,
Sure. So, go back to Ayurvedic medicine, 1 to 2 bowel movements a day. If you're having more than that, it's probably a problem. And less than 1 a day, it's probably a problem. And you need to work on that. Looking at what the stool is. What you want is a stool generally that floats. That's going to indicate that you've got a good amount of fiber in your diet, although floating is not a necessary thing. You want the color to be a brown color, and you want it to be formed so that when it goes in the toilet, it stays formed. You don't want soft serve ice cream. You don't want liquid, obviously, and you don't want hard little pellets. that are going to be an indication of not getting adequate hydration. So you can look at the stool and you can look at the frequency of bowel movements and be doing pretty good. And then you're asking, is there any abdominal pain? Are there any other symptoms that are going on? The gut only has a couple different ways in which it can manifest symptoms. I can have reflux, I can have diarrhea, I can have constipation, I can have pain. And so you're listening to those and you're looking at what the frequency of your bowel movement is. And that's going to be a great first start. You don't need to do a $300 microbiome test to figure out that you're doing okay. Now, if you have problems and you're working with your diet and you're not getting better and you're continuing to have severe constipation or significant diarrhea or significant pain, then you may want to do something that's going to say, well, let me figure out what's going on underneath. And if I can, I'm just going to jump in under the hood and say, underneath the way in which, from a functional medicine standpoint, we talk about a terminology that we say dig in. And dig in is looking at how is that working? Well, how's that working? How's digestion working? How is intestinal permeability? Is there a leakiness in the gut? How is the gut microbiome? That I could talk about the gut microbiome for the rest of the day into the night. And then we would sleep for 8 or 9 hours and we could talk about it again for all day tomorrow. There's just so much fascinating information of what we're learning there. And you can evaluate where that's at with some older tools or newer tools. If we want to talk about that, I'm glad to jump in. But then we also look at what's happening with the immune system. Is there any inflammation? And what's happening with what is called the enteric, the gut nervous system, and that is the gut brain microbiome axis, where the information from your microbiome is actually feeding up into your brain, and it affects your gut feelings, it affects your emotions, it affects how you're feeling and moving in the world.
I know we're about to get into some nitty gritty details here. So if you're eating food right now, this may not be the best. You might want to pause it for the next minute. But I want to actually focus in on some of the poop descriptions that you had, because there's still some nuance here that I haven't heard clearly explained. I just want to double check a couple of things with you. Having a single nice well-formed log versus multiple smaller logs, as long as they're well-formed, is that okay?
Yeah, that's okay. That has more to do with motility. So having a single turd, a single log versus several well-formed logs. That has to do with how your motility is doing at the time that you have a bowel movement. Encourage people to not try to force it. And not to spend a ton of time on the toilet, just to allow whatever comes out to come out, and do it in that way. So is that?
Yeah, actually, speaking of that, so
more detail.
I do want to get into more detail, because as a parent, sometimes I just need I want to break and I want to just escape, just escape on the toilet and read my phone and just kind of like zone out for a few minutes. And it's easy, especially with our phones, to just get distracted and like, 10 minutes pass by. And so while I'm on the toilet, I noticed kind of what you're saying. There's these two phases of, in the beginning, in like 2 minutes, I could just be done. And I feel like I got like 80% of it out. But it's like this last 20% that I feel like if I spend another 10 minutes there, I could get it all out. And that is not as well formed. It is not the same formation as the first couple of turds that came out. And so I'm wondering, is that what you're talking about in terms of I really should just, stop when I like the 80-20 rule, like 80% is out. I feel good enough. Let's just not spend forever there and let the other stuff form in my gut a little bit more.
Yes. Yeah. Because the water will be absorbed. So like, when you're doing that and you need time away from your kids, okay, get up, close the lid, put your pants back on. You can sit back down on the toilet. You'll be fine, but the risk The risk is twofold. One is that you're going to actually lead to some involuntary movements, which is stimulate, or which is the what's called valsalva. You're bearing down, and as you bear down, that's going to cause the veins in the around the rectum to begin to expand, and there's a high risk of hemorrhoid in doing that, and so you want to avoid that. You don't want to be bearing down. We also find that the actual biomechanics of the way in which toilets are set up are not very good, because we are made to squat to have a bowel movement, because it straightens out the angle of the rectum, versus when we're sitting on the toilet, it's at a little bit of an angle, and so we have to bear down a little bit to do that. So we don't want to spend a lot of time bearing down. Have some other consequences.
I got one of those squatty potty things to like raise your feet off the ground a little bit. But let's just say we're using that and we're just relaxed. Like I'm not actually forcing anything. I'm just relaxing. And then, if I wait 10 minutes, then more comes out. It's not well formed. Is that still as bad?
And so it's not as bad, but what you're describing, and it's usually in the 6 to 8 minute time frame. That's the rhythm of the major migratory motor complex, That is what a normal rhythm of the waves that move through the intestine are. And so, to me, go be done. If another wave comes back and there's enough stool in there that it needs to happen again, that's perfectly fine. And what you're doing by just sitting there for a few minutes is not a major problem, but it does have some potential risk if you're bearing down. So I don't want to provide that as like everyone should do that. I think you're better off if you just evacuate what you have, and then if you have more to get rid of at a later point in time, then you will. Like having a second bowel movement a day is not a problem. Having multiple, patients who have 3-4 bowel movements a day, that's a problem. So we have to work with their patterns and behavior around that.
Yeah, one thing I've noticed, I try to be, thoughtful about my patterns, behaviors, why am I doing certain things, what's the reaction, and I think that over the past, I want to say year or two, especially with COVID and just needing more mental breaks, I am on most of the day, is I think I call it boredom poops. Like I'm just trying to, just like let myself be bored and just kind of let the mind wander, which in real talk, meditation, like 5 minutes meditation, probably way better spent than the extra 5-10 minutes on the toilet on the phone. But I thank you for your thoughts on that. That makes a lot of sense. One extra discussion on this about the formation of the stool. Is there much thought or difference between a hard, not super hard dry like Play-Doh, but just like a smoother, slightly firmer stool versus softer, fuzzier looking ones? They're both formed, they hold their shape, but the surface seems softer and fuzzier as opposed to like the harder Play-Doh. Again, I'm not talking about the super hard, dry, dehydrated poop. I'm talking about just, I'm talking about something more in the middle.
Well, I do, but you're really talking more about hydration status at this point in time. And so when you see that there's not a need to pull all the water out of the stool, in the severe cases, like the Play-Doh that's been dried for outside for 5 days, you don't want that, so you want it to be malleable, and Play-Doh's really a good example of being able to do that. But if it's a little bit softer, then you should see, are there any foods that are causing it? Because you can have like a long string stool that's pretty soft, still stays, it still holds its shape, but that's actually in the overall Bristol stool index, that's moving towards the context of maybe there's a little bit something that is causing an overstimulation of the bowels to go on. So you really want it to be in formed and not that kind of, as you said, soft on the edges. That's optimal.
Okay, so when I say soft,
have it be soft.
When I say soft on the edges, I mean it's definitely holding its shape, but it just has like a fuzzy-ish look to it. But it's not gonna like it's not gonna like crumble into sawdust, if that makes sense. Like, so what I'm talking about is like, does the surface matter that much? If it's like, a little soft fuzzy versus like more of a smooth sausage.
Well, again, it's indicating that your colon is not needing to accept the water that's in it. That's what the colon's job is. But it does highlight that there's probably something that's acting to push it through a little more quickly. If it were sitting in the colon for a day, it would be absorbed and you wouldn't have soft fuzziness around the edges. So is there something that is stimulating or pushing the movement to occur? For instance, there's some things like magnesium supplements that will do that. Vitamin C supplements can do that. They can kind of push things through. We use them therapeutically for people who are constipated, but for people who are not constipated, I'd rather not have them take that kind of magnesium, for example, magnesium citrate, and so that they had a firmer stool, not one that is quote unquote soft and fuzzy on the outside.
Actually, it's funny you mentioned that, because now that I think about it, the poops that I have that are like that are like softer and fuzzier, that's usually going to be happening for me because of one of two things. So my mind, my body are just so connected. They know this is going to happen. It's usually the workout. In the morning, I do my workout stream. I have to be on. It's like I'm performing basically. And a lot of times I take pre-workout, which has caffeine in it. But even if which caffeine definitely stimulates me down there. Even if I don't take the caffeine, just knowing that I'm going to work out and I'm going to be on stream, like a performance type thing, my body knows just evacuate, let's just empty everything regardless of the formation. I would say it's diarrhea-like, but it's to the point where like on the weekend when I know I'm not going to work out and I know I'm not going to be like performing, if you will, the poop quality is actually like, I would say top notch. It's like a lot smoother, a lot cleaner. The fact that it seems like my body and mind are connected with each other and that they know I need to be on, so I'm just going to evacuate before my physical performance of working out. Is that a good thing? Does that make it okay in this context?
I'm not sure I can talk about whether it's okay or not. I mean, it's an adaptive response, and I'm sure some of it is caffeine, because caffeine is certainly going to have that kind of effect overall. But you said it's happening even without caffeine, so that seems to me that's more of an activation that's going on, and I've seen that, and I relate to it, where before I go speak, before I go perform, that there may be an evacuation that occurs just to be able to get things out of there. So that's a common response, but it's not, as long as you're not having diarrhea, and you're not losing nutrients, and your fluid status is okay, it shouldn't be a problem. But if it's something that is happening all the time, and then I'd say, well, gosh, let's see what's going on with your nutrient status, and let's see what's going on with your hydration status, and look at something like a bioimpedance analysis, where we're looking at your intracellular water and your electrolytes and seeing, okay, are those things in balance? And there's ways to be able to look at and determine, is it an issue for you at this point in time? The BIA would be a simple way to be able to do that.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind. Thank you. I really love this discussion because I never hear it talked about in this much detail. Because a lot of times, like when I look up gut health stuff, it's so generic. They never get into like the fuzzy, the yummy details. But moving on from the drawings and the visuals, one question actually that just came up in chat was, in this I've wondered myself, is there such a thing as too much fiber, insoluble versus soluble? And I'll give a contextual explanation of this. I have noticed personally that I have a limit. I know like fiber, it gets talked about in the media, like it's such a good thing, eat more and more fiber. But I've noticed there is a dose dependent response where too much for me does lead to diarrhea, does lead to sawdust, whether it's too much Cheerios, whether it's too much, just I gorge on vegetables, lots and lots of vegetables. I notice there is a certain threshold where I cross it and it's not good the next day. It's not clean.
Well, there's not a whole lot of fiber in Cheerios, so let's not go there. But you're making an important distinction around soluble and insoluble fiber, first of all. So soluble fiber, which we're going to see in various kinds of prebiotics, from acacia root and psyllium and things like that. That's actually going to help seed or I should say feed the gut bacteria. And so it will cause changes in the microbiome, which are usually beneficial, but depending upon which soluble fiber you're using and what the overall state of your gut microbiome is, you can actually overdo or misdo the kinds of soluble fiber and cause an imbalance of growth to be able to occur. So when you're looking at that, I want you to kind of stratify out what's happening with soluble fiber, which is acting as a prebiotic and causing changes in the creation of short chain fatty acids and other kind of metabolites that are occurring in my gut, versus insoluble fiber. That's going to be like vegetable fiber, things that you're not able to digest and that pass through. They add the bulk to your stool. Now, on the insoluble fiber side and that bulk to the stool, there's a point where too much bulk can actually affect that migratory motor complex. And we can see some people who have too much bulk, and especially if they're dehydrated, they're going to dry things out and have big amounts. FOS can stand for fructooligosaccharides, which is a kind of prebiotic, or it can stand in medical terms for full of shit. Where we can see that people, they have abdominal pain, they're constipated, and we look at what's called a KUB, or a flat plate of the abdomen, and it's like, oh yeah, those bowels are filled with stool, and they're not able to evacuate. That's too much fiber. Now, what you want to do is you want to be, kind of increasing up on the fiber ladder to be able to do that. You're right. More fiber is better. And we find that people who are able to take, 35, 40 grams of fiber a day are going to be healthier in terms of their gut health and their overall health, with decreases in diabetes and insulin resistance and pre-diabetes and metabolic syndrome and all those kinds of things. But you can't just start taking 35 to 40 grams of protein a day. The average American
you mean
takes
fiber?
about 15 grams of protein, of fiber. What did I say?
You said protein. It's okay. Fiber.
I meant fiber.
Close
So
enough.
about 15 grams of fiber a day. Now, a Paleolithic diet, or if we go to, the hunter-gatherers in Africa, it's like 120 grams of fiber a day. And we see, much larger amounts of stool that are there, and differences in their microbiome. But we know that, in the 35, 40 grams, we're going to get a ton of the benefits of fiber. And if you're having issues with fiber, you notice this dose-dependent process, take a look at, is it the soluble fiber or is it the insoluble fiber? And then, if you, I'm going to say, binge on, eating a whole bunch of vegetables all at once, and that's very different than what you usually eat, then you're going to have a significant increase in your insoluble fiber, and your gut's going to be like, oh, I'm kind of distended right now, and I need things through. If you've got a good rhythm, that's great. But if you have an rhythm that's going on in your migratory motor complex because of sympathetic overdrive, then you can actually precipitate a problem. And that problem is a big problem. It's a pain problem. It's constipation, but you can work with it, and you can use agents like vitamin C and magnesium citrate to kind of push things through if you need to.
Actually, I wanted to zero in on the insoluble fiber thing, because I have this burning question that I've not heard a good answer for, which is about insoluble fiber and just the bulk of vegetables. Let me give a specific example. 100 grams of broccoli, for example. If we look at the 100 grams, what's in there? It's about 10 grams of macros, where it's like, 6 grams carbs, 3 grams protein, around there. So about 10 grams of that. So 10% is actual macros, macronutrients. And then the other 90% of that, the other 90 grams, what is that? Because I know some of it's water. Obviously, some of it's water. But a lot of it is, in my mind, I'm thinking, a lot of that's insoluble fiber, because that's just vegetable bulk that we cannot digest. However, when I look at the grams of fiber on it, out of those 6.6 grams of carbs, 2.6 grams is fiber. So And I know they usually further subdivide that to soluble versus insoluble. But in my head, I'm thinking like that other 90 grams, a lot of that is insoluble fiber, but it's just not the definition that I hear. So I wanted to hear your take on all that.
Wow, I've never thought about it that way, and you're teaching me. It's a great question, but I've just never thought of it that way. So I would just go and Google, like, how many grams of fiber are in 100 grams of broccoli, and be able to look at that way. A lot of it's water weight, um, and and I don't know what the rest of it is. That's a great question.
But in general, is it safe to say that we could assume that basically that vegetable matter of cellulose and whatnot that we cannot extract nutrients out of, that's basically insoluble fiber? Is that bulk that's going to be pushing stuff through?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. To answer your question specifically, and then you also raise a piece there where you're looking at the carbs versus the net carbs. Where you're subtracting out what the actual fiber is, and we can get into a conversation about net carbs as it relates to ketosis and ketogenic diets and approaches there. And that's really where I think about net carbs more, not so much on what is the actual fiber content
Yeah.
that's present.
Okay.
And there's a couple tools like Chronometer. I like Chronometer as a tool for being able to plug in information.
I love that
as
tool.
an app that tells me about what the nutrients are, what the fiber content is. I think it's a super tool to be able to use.
Absolutely. So the next topic I want to get onto is just, the nuance in the diet. Achieving perfection is so difficult in so many of these functional medicine discussions. What I always hear described, it just sounds like the perfect diet that I don't know who's gonna be able to achieve like this, this day and age, the perfect diet. Because I try to live by the 80-20 rule of the good enough. Let's just get in there and let's do most of the things good, but let's give some flexibility to still have some junk, to go out to a wedding, enjoy whatever's served, just enjoy it. Like get together with friends, just enjoy it, that kind of stuff. So I was curious in terms of if we are living a pretty active, healthy life. Like I'm an active, healthy guy. I exercise, work out. I try to find that balance of still rest and recover, all that kind of stuff. For the active, healthy crowd, is there an increase in tolerance to junk and just having a little bit of straying away from perfection?
Is there increased intolerance to junk? Well, there's a couple layers to the question here, and you and I have talked about this a little bit, but let me just go into it for a while. First of all, I mentioned the other day Henrik Ibsen, the playwright, who said, everything in moderation, including moderation. Which I think is important. It's like we've got to find balance in our life, and it's not about being perfect. Because if it is, none of us are going to get there. And so how do we find ways to be able to move in the world, that creates balance? Now, for some people who are really sick, small changes in their macronutrient intake, can have some significant symptoms that will develop from there. And we find that the diet overall, which is really quite out of balance for most Americans at this point in time, like, well, what is the right diet? There is no one right diet for everybody. And we can look at low carb diets, we can, ketogenic diets, Mediterranean diets, low fat diets, and one of the things you see when you look at the research that's done on this, and Christopher Gardner at Stanford is great in terms of the research that he's done and the way that he thinks about it and talks about it, is that, most of these diets, when they get applied in research, are basically whole foods diets. They're removing simple sugars and they're removing processed foods, and people do better on them. And so then what is the one right diet for you at one point in time? There's therapeutic diets. So like when I'm getting, chemotherapy or dealing with insulin resistance, which I had, a ketogenic diet was a great diet to be able to take, but it's not something that I want or need to be able to hold to for a long period of time, because we find that ketogenic diets tend to decrease the diversity in the gut microbiome. not something that we want to have. So that therapeutic diet is useful for that specific indication. But by and large, we want to get back to a diet that's going to, have whole foods that are not processed. That being said, if you're doing well and you have some balance in your diet, and you go to a birthday, or you're celebrating something that's going on, or having a day a week where it's like, okay, Sunday is my eat anything day, and you do that, and then the thing is, see how you feel with that. Right. And if you feel okay with that, it's like, okay, I have some balance. I'm doing well. I'm not going to keep doing that every day, but I'm going to, I feel like I've got some reserves and things are doing well. Now that's different than the subset of patients I see who are sick. And when they make that one transgression and they start feeling real crappy, then it's like, okay, well, you don't have the reserves yet to be able to do that. Once you're back into sufficient balance, you're going to be able to eat other foods. So, as I was laughing as you were saying, because it's like I've had, dinners and meals with, Jeff Bland and Mark Hyman and Terry Walls and many others. And it's like, they're not perfect in what they're eating all the time. By and large, like I've eaten many, many meals with Mark, and we were actually, we shared an apartment at the Cleveland Clinic, and by and large, he's eating really well, but then once in a while he doesn't. And it's not, there's not a focus on trying to be perfect all the time. It's finding what that balance is. Now, you asked another aspect of the question, and I've seen it personally, but that is people who are not eating a great diet, and then they start to eat a whole foods diet, and let's call it a Mediterranean diet, for just to pick an example, and they're eating a good whole food Mediterranean diet, and then they go and they have donuts and a piece of cake, and they feel terrible. And it's like, wow, I didn't feel terrible before when I had this. What did you do to me? And it's like, what's the body saying? Hey, this isn't what make me feel good. And so it's giving you instantaneous feedback that when you clean up the system and make it more efficient, it's able to see the inefficiencies much more clearly than when it's in a state of a veiled state of cloudiness all the time, where it's not able to really differentiate, the good from the bad. And, I do see that commonly. Some patients don't like that. They say, well, it's not fair that you did that. But what I have found is that as we work together over time and they get to that point of balance, then having the day off works just fine, and it doesn't create long-term consequences for them. And this is where you need that. You got to have a pop-off valve to be able to, because what happens for some patients, sadly, is that they can't maintain it. They have this view of perfection, and then they eat something that is not on the plan, and maybe they enjoy the taste, and I loved hearing your view of how you introduce foods and the various taste qualities to them. Give the nutrients first and give the super high palatable taste things last. But they do that, and they're like, oh wow, I really like this, and so now I'm going to eat the whole pint of Ben and Jerry's ice cream. And since I'm doing that, I may as well have a chocolate croissant on top of it. And well, I guess I'm going to order pizza, for dinner with the, you see how it goes. And all of a sudden they're down a pathway where their attempt to perfection has led them to not be able to have balance at all. Right. And so perfection's not balance. So finding what that balance point is for you. And again, coming back to, well, what is the diet that's best for you? What is the food plan that's best for you? I'm going to just come and say, like, whole foods, that's the most important thing to be able to do as the base approach to food. And then you'll have other kinds of things, now and again, to bring other diversity and balance and joy to your life and your palate. And one thing I commonly say, and I was having this conversation with a cancer patient yesterday, and we're going to have her use a ketogenic diet in the approach. But the idea was, we're not trying to remove all sweetness from your life. If you if we're moving in a way and you feel like, gosh, you've taken away, Dr. Hanaway, every sweet thing in my life, that's not going to be sustainable. I know that. So we've got to find ways to find balance with that.
I love that, the finding the balance with everything. But one of the things that I'll hear, and this may be kind of just a speculative, hypothetical discussion we're about to get into, but I hear some of the perfectionist crowd, they'll say stuff like, just you wait. Where like they look at, let's talk about an example of Olympians, or not just Olympians, but just high performance athletes, like, you know, people who are doing marathons, people who are doing these long cardio ventures, these a lot of weightlifting, CrossFit, something like that. You are doing so much high performance activity for a while, and we see that these athletes, they are consuming simple sugars, they're consuming Gatorade, they're consuming what a lot of perfectionists would call junk. And so I'm wondering, in that context, is it just fine for them because they actually need the simple sugars? Or are they setting themselves up for long-term issues? Because we hear about the Michael Phelps eating 10,000 calories at McDonald's a day in the Olympics, but what about 20 years from now? In your experience, or just hypothetically, what are your thoughts on what's going to on this situation?
Well, there are a couple different aspects there. The first one is in relationship to, you know, the amount of carbs that are needed. Just like with growing kids, they need the carbs. You're not going to put them on a low fat diet. You're not going to put them on a ketogenic diet. They need the carbs there in order to be able to have energy. And so we find with high level athletes, or, you know, if I'm going out on a century ride, you know, 100-mile ride, it's like, I'm going to need some carbs during that time, because my body is going to need some fuel. I do really well on a ketogenic approach, you know, but I am going to need some carbs to be able to finish that 100 miles. And so, you know, I'm focused on being able to do that, because I'm not going to be, you know, taking a keto cup in the middle of the ride, and it's not going to be able to be metabolized quickly enough to give me the energy that I need. And since I'm running on a relatively low glycogen stores anyways, you know, I've got to give some energy for that. So that makes perfect sense within these higher level athletes. You know, we go to, you know, an English Premier League, you know, footballer, you know, and they're running 7-8 miles during this time, a lot of sprints, start stops. You know, it's like they actually need that glycogen. They need the glucose and the carbs to be able to meet the needs of that. Or a high performance swimmer like Mike Phelps. Now, I can't speak to, you know, what the, you know, benefit or lack of benefit of eating at 10,000 calories of McDonald's. Like, that just is like, that doesn't make sense to me. I think that's a bad idea. I think that there's other ways that you can get that caloric density, you know, that's going to be good for you, that doesn't have some of the, you know, crappy oils and crappy carbs that are part of what that's going to be inherently. And that's partly why, you know, trying to set people up to be able to have the tools as they go forward. You know, I said earlier, and I have this little visual I use when I'm talking, you know, it's like, well, here's someone, and, you know, he's walking down the path, and he's walking down the path, and he thinks, because he doesn't have any symptoms, that he's doing okay. But as he keeps walking down the path, now he starts developing symptoms. It's like, oh, I have to walk back this way in the other direction. Oops, sorry for the mic. In order to be able to start to get towards wellness. And if we develop really bad habits that are hard for us to break, then, you know, that's where we want to, you know, try to teach our kids some tools about, you know, having a good relationship with vegetables, you know, and we, you know, the idea of having some balance, but not rigidity in the diet. That's how I approach it.
So actually, you bring up a good point, or a topic I want to talk about, which is kids, setting them up for a nutritious diet. Because I think that's one of the things that a lot of us, we think to ourselves, oh man, if only I started these good habits when I was a kid, then XYZ, you know? And so we think about the next generation. I'm a parent. I got a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old. I'm trying to do my best to get them on a whole foods diet, the 80-20 thing. get them enjoying things. And one of the things I talked about earlier, which I'll talk really quickly here, is one of the ways I feel successful as a parent in terms of getting them to eat vegetables and organ meat and other types of nutritious whole foods is I take a page out of Stefan Guyenet's book, Guyenet, Guyuenet, for anyone who's curious, who talks about the palatability of food. When my kids are hungry for dinner, that's the meal that I focus on nutrient density, and I give them basically like a 9-course meal, starting with, when they're hungry, least palatable food, and then I work through the courses to most palatable, most delicious foods. I start with plain frozen vegetables, a medley, steam it. I mean, not really steam, but microwave it with a little bit of water, so it's basically steamed, and give that to them plain, no seasoning. They eat it up. It's actually a little bit sweet. And then I do a little bit of organ meat, just like a spoonful, some liver, hearts, kidney, and then some little bit of beans, because the way I make my beans, I think they're actually really delicious. I do some salt, pepper, and a little bit of lard, a little bit of bacon fat, just to flavor it. Oh, so good. And then the main course, which is usually some sort of starch, typically rice and a meat. Some sort of that's the main course dish, followed by then the more palatable foods, like our desserts is usually like fruits, different types of fruits, sometimes a little bit of bamba, which is like this peanut dish, I try to give them some diversity, maybe a little bit of seaweed, and then finally, if it deemed appropriate for a reward, a super special treat like a little bit of a donut, a little bit of a cookie, something like that, if they had finished everything, that kind of stuff. So I personally found that successful working with palatability, but but as a parent, I am trying to I want to do right to get my kids set up for life with a good diet, a good gut microbiome. I was curious on your thoughts on just setting children up for health, trying to get them started right with nutrition.
Well, we talked about this the other day, and I love that approach in terms of palatability and being able to think in that way. So my kids now are 26 and 28, and working to what we did was really more restrict all the simple sugars and a lot of those treats, early on. Initially being vegetarian, then moving into omnivores, but really avoiding any kind of sweet at all. And what we did was we created, kids who were like craving sweets, and they would go, to their friends, and they would not have balance in their relationship to sweets. And we were able to work that out over time. I'll tell you a little story about that, where my son was working on a Olympic development soccer team, and he was going to have the opportunity to be able to go and play in Madrid, and kind of train with the youth team at Real Madrid. And he was like, well, I challenged him to 30 days of no sugar and no gluten. And what we found was a difference in his training at that point in time. He was like 14, 15 years old, and he was able to feel it and notice the difference. And that really put him on a different nutritional path, and so he began to feel the experience. And now he's got a balanced view with the whole thing. But I think that getting your kids at a young age to be able to have balance, I think the palatability approach is great. When I was in medical school back in the dark ages, the early research was coming out from the Bogalusa Heart Project and others, that showed that the desire for sweets is something that emerges early, and if we overdo it, then the kids want nothing else. And so finding a way to be able to move towards that sequential palatability and be able to, and teaching them those aspects of balance, I think it's a great idea and a great way to be able to approach this. The other thing is that, as you've said, like, so you're getting fiber in there to help, initially to be able to get some distension and get the digestive processes going, but we find that bringing in those proteins early, so those organ meats in the process very early, because they're going to be stimulating the digestive process in the stomach. It's the proteins that are going to be activating the what are called chymotrypsin or trypsinogen and trypsin and pepsin. Sorry. which are going to be breaking down the protein. So like getting those early in the sequence is going to be really quite important to be able to do, and whether it's organ meats or, I mean, I'm non-denominational as it relates to which kinds of proteins. So, some people think animal proteins are great. If you're going to do those, you want to make sure that they're organic, grass-fed if possible, or wild fish, doing that. If you're going to have, plant-based proteins, making sure that they're organic, and making sure that there's no reactivity that's going on. So eating good proteins, but getting that early in the cycle of feeding the kids is, and it's true for adults as well, but doing that kind of process that you're doing, I think, is a great way and an important way. And we have to be careful about the introduction of sweets, but we do have to introduce them, because if we don't, then we're going to have this kind of reactivity that occurs, where they're going to be craving it because, as I said, you need some sweetness in your life.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel you on that. It's one of those things that it just, as a parent, it feels like a struggle, especially I consider myself to be health conscious. And so I'm always trying to look out for what's the best. And it's easy to get overwhelmed with all this information. And I think a lot of my questions today stem from the relatively health conscious person who's just trying to get it right and realizing I've been on both ends, right? Where the if it fits your macro bro crowd of, bro, I can get jacked off of just protein shakes and donuts, and I can get super low body fat. And yes, I've been there. I've also been to the other place of, perfection. I got to be like so paranoid about, oh crap, I had some gluten today. Am I gonna have a flare up? Is this like, did I ruin my life for the next 30 years? And then finally just settling in the middle of, what does good enough look like, and what's optimal enough? And that's kind of where I've been in terms of the health conscious journey that I think a lot of us go through. And so for my the next question I'm about to ask, before I do that, I want to open this up for Q&A. We're doing another session of Q&A, so I'm going to clear the question queue. If you have any questions you would like to do, go ahead and queue it up now. !Q. Type out !Q. Type it out, and my bot will grab it. My question for you about the health conscious crowd, what do you think today's health conscious crowd is getting wrong? Or some things? Does that be the one thing?
No, I mean, yeah. I'm trying to just feel into what arises in the question. First of all, I think that first, in relationship to foods, the conversation that we've just been having, that there's some assumption that there is the one right thing, the holy grail of what I'm supposed to eat and what nutrients and nutritional supplements I'm supposed to be able to take. I think that the health conscious crowd is overemphasizing the use of supplements. I think that they're actually necessary to be able to help support, but they are not the answer, and that the things focus on those aspects of our modifiable lifestyle factors of the food we eat, what we're putting into our body, how much we sleep, how much we move, and how we deal with the stresses. Like, those are the principal things, and we need to focus on that a lot more. We're not going to supplement ourselves out of poor sleep. We are not going to minimize our foods or modify our macronutrient and micronutrient intake to deal with the fact that we're not moving and exercising. And if we're not dealing with stress in our life in a good way, and stress is going to be there, it is part of life. We want to be able to optimize it and not move from a place of distress, as Selye talked about, from a place of eustress, of being able to deal with the stresses of a wedding or a celebration or other new things that are going on. And in fact, we see that change is the only thing that's constant. Let's look at what's happened this year in everybody's lives, and how are we dealing with the stressors of that, of decreasing changing relationships and changing the way in which we're connecting with people. And those are difficult. Those are stressors. How are we dealing with it? How are we finding balance? And let's not lose sight of that. And so I think that the health conscious crowd is sort of assuming that there is a holy grail of the one right diet and the one right set of nutritional supplements that is going to make all the difference in the world. And that's not what's going to happen. We need to be able to be in right relationship, take time to listen to our body, connect to each other, be out in the natural world. I think those are the key things from my perspective. Now, I can go into other aspects, but that's really the big broad brushstroke on it.
Great, thank you. Our first question is from I Eat Stars. He says, why does the body, after having consumed all types of food and matter, I think he's referring to like junk food and stuff, showing no signs of allergic reactions or sensitivity, all of a sudden it flips a switch? Because I know he recently had some issues with food. Is there any chance I can regain the tolerance I once had or that I believed I had? And if so, how do I achieve this? Or is this something I just have to live with now?
So we talked about this a little bit earlier, and in the setting where someone has been able to eat many different kinds of foods and not have an issue, but really not be listening to what's going on, and then they move towards eating a healthier diet, one that's more whole food focused, that they do decrease their tolerance of some of these other foods that are going to cause inefficiency and not work in the system as well. And one of the things that happens for all of us is that as time marches on, our reserves decrease and our capacity to be able to deal with these kinds of insults, decreases. And so to that extent, it's like a decreased tolerance. But I like to know a little bit more. So if I'm, sitting in a conversation with I Eat Stars and understanding exactly, well, what is it, the food that you're not tolerant to, and what's happening at this point in time? Because it could be that there is some other inflammatory process that's going on. It could be, that there is some kind of alteration in the gut microbiome that has been shifted due to changes in stress or sleep or movement and exercise, separate from food or from an exposure. I would say, on the personal level, I had kind of minor gut issues as I went through medical school, but I was working at a clinic in Paul and got a lot of parasites, and I can say my guts have never been the same since that time. So like my window of what I have to pay attention to is much narrower than it was at an earlier point in my life. And so I would be looking to say, well, what is the trigger that changed it? There were no signs of sensitivity before, now there are. And that's one of the things that a functional medicine practitioner does, is like, we look at the timeline of what's happening and listen to the story, and we say, well, what's the trigger? What was happening in life right at that point in time when things tipped over? And then we start working with that trigger and related mediators, similar kinds of things that we can help to be able to improve the reserves and improve the resilience of the system.
Speaking of the triggers thing, I'll speak from personal experience. 100% agree. My ankylosing spondylitis started in my mid-20s. And what triggered it? Well, I was going through the most stressful time of my life. By far, I was so stressed. One was I was just bought my first house with a friend, co-owning together and fixing it up. So, I mean, there's good and bad to that. I won't get into the details. But there's obviously a lot of stress working with a partner and living with him and trying to make house decisions. Also, on top of that, I broke up with my girlfriend at the time, who's my wife, Helen, and we got back together, happy ending, but it was extremely stressful couple of months, and I've never been that stressed. In fact, every morning I woke up around 5 or 6 a.m. unable to keep sleeping because I had that pit of stress in my stomach that I know a lot of guys, we manifest stress like that. And then what happened? A month or so of this daily stress, waking up like this, I then had, boom, the symptoms of AS manifest itself. That was the stress was the catalyst, like the match that just lit the haystack. And sure enough, on top of the stress of waking up at 5 or 6 a.m., unable to sleep, I also had the well-known symptom of my mid back around T8 to T12, or mid lower back, that pain of sleeping more than 5 or 6 hours. I would just get that excruciating pain where I can't sleep anymore. I have to get up and walk around. So all of this stuff just started stacking and stacking. And it was a quick downward spiral, which led me on this very long journey of trying to figure out what is wrong with me, looking into functional medicine, figuring out that, my trigger is basically stress and gluten. Reduce those. I'm in a much better place. I don't need medication. I'm okay. And so I just completely agree. Like, I think it's so important to look at what is causing these issues. I always say chronic problems usually have chronic sources, and we should start looking at what's going on day to day with our life. So,
yeah. And just to jump back to when talking about AS earlier, so stress will cause changes in the distribution of the gut bacteria. We'll see an increase in gram-negative bacteria that are present there, especially if there is any fear component that is involved. And we also know that the same kinds of stressors will increase permeability in the gut, leaky gut. And so both of those things in the setting of a genetic predisposition, were set up for you too. Those were the things that tipped you over. Could have been other kinds of triggers, but it gave you, because you listened and you said, okay, well, what was happening here? And you've gone to then understand how that trigger that happened at that point in time is a trigger that you need to be aware of, from now and in the future. And so that's why you're spending time working on and both asking good questions, but looking at yourself and listening to what's happening in your body. And fortunately, that's kind of rare these days. I hope that there's, a number of people out there who say like, okay, well, I'm willing to, do the work and be able to investigate that and see what's going on, what's underneath it.
Yeah. One of the things about my story is, I like my back pain became so crippling because I actually was dealing with two issues at once, probably related to it could be related to the AS, but one was couldn't sleep more than 5 hours a night, basically, and pain-free to the AS, right? Mid lower back pain flaring up, T8 through T12 on the spine. The second issue was I was having piriformis syndrome entrapping the sciatic nerve, so that excruciating sciatic nerve pain completely crippling me to the point where I had to use a cane. In my early 20s, I was using a cane. I couldn't sit for long hours. I was in so much pain that it would I'd rather just black out than deal with the pain because of how bad it was. I was crawling to the bathroom in the middle of the night because it was so painful to walk that it was easier just to crawl to the bath to get to the toilet in the middle of the night. And so about my story, when you get to that low of you're crawling to the bathroom, you can't put your own underwear on in your early 20s, you just hit this low of desperation of I'll do anything. I don't care what it is. I'll try anything. And so that level of desperation is what, sadly, it took for me to really appreciate health and appreciate my body and just do whatever it takes. I'm going to figure out an answer. I'm going to start doing study of N=1. If I change this variable, does anything improve? I never gave up on that hope that there is a way out of this. A lot of that actually came to a discussion I had with a friend at church because, I kept crippling. I was very crippled and hobbling, walking around. Everyone asked oh, what's wrong with your ankle? It's not my ankle, it's my back. Oh, what's wrong with your back? Oh, you should go see a doctor. I did see a doctor. You should go see a chiropractor. I did see many chiropractors. It's like I kept going through over and over until finally there was one guy who said, oh yeah, I had back problems too. I said, yeah, I don't think as bad as me. He's like, no, worse. He had very similar problems, but numbing pain, months of numbed leg pain. And then I got hope because you're better. He's playing basketball. He seems normal again. And he told me. And so that set me off on the journey of there's got to be an answer. And so I just kept looking and trying new things. Unfortunately, wasted lots of money on stupid things that didn't do anything, but is money well wasted in this journey of recovery and learning to listen to my body? So you were smiling for a second. Did you have something to chime in on?
Well, I mean, I think it's a great story, but one of the things that's unique is that you went into that N=1 and said, I'm gonna work, I'm gonna investigate. But there's ads that many times they're coming on and CNN or one of the other kind of channels at nighttime of these biologics for ankylosing spondylitis, which actually weren't out there at the time that you had the problem, but now they're really pushing them. They're pushing them because the injections are costing $2,000 to $5,000 a month. And they do get rid of the problem, but they don't get to the source of the problem. And they do have some long-term consequences. in terms of suppressing the immune system. And we don't know the full extent of what those consequences are. And you did it, by saying, what can I do to go upstream and the root cause and listen to the triggers? And it's not easy work to do. And as I said before, it wasn't prevention. It was like you started having symptoms, and that's what caused you gave you the passion to really be able to discover what's underneath this. And I'm so pleased that you did it, because it's a great story, and I hope it inspires others as well.
Yeah, definitely. I've had actually ankylosing spondylitis folks. I had like 1 or 2 viral posts about ankylosing spondylitis that occasionally people actually find, and they find my Twitch channel and they talk to me about it. And I'm really glad that they find me, because then I'm a story of hope for a lot of them. And for those who want to read more about my story and the little variables I was tweaking, you can go to dominationtime.com/leakygut, and you can see a lot of the details in terms of what I was trying and tweaking. And just full disclosure, so about the Humira stuff, because I was on Humira for a while, on and off, I would tweak it with like taking out gluten and stress, and then going on and off Humira. Did it fix it? So you can see the full details at dominationtime.com/leakygut. I'm currently on a very low dose of Humira that I pretty much don't feel like I need, and I probably will drop it soon enough. But I'm still doing a little bit more tweaking and testing till I completely just, I'm done with that. But it's way better than before. Before I needed it every 2 weeks. Now I'm like once every couple of months, and I barely notice it. Sometimes I forget. So I honestly don't feel like I need it at this point. But I'm at that. I'm getting to that stage of just like, yeah, let's just stop. So.
Yeah. So you said it's domination time/leaky gut. Now I want to just take a minute and talk about this idea of leaky gut or intestinal permeability, because within functional medicine, this is something that we've been talking about for over 30 years. You go back to the original research from Dr. Bjarnson, well-known gastroenterologist at King's College in London, who studied it and demonstrated, and yet it was poo-pooed, maybe the wrong word, denigrated, indicated as being, sort of fool's gold by gastroenterologists for many, many years. And yet we found that there was something that actually stimulating the immune system in a subset of people who were having problems. And then we feed forward to the work of Dr. Alessio Fasano, who's, the head of mucosal biology, mucosal immunology, gastroenterologist, immunologist at Harvard. He demonstrated, what was going on. He did it in the model of celiac disease, but then talked about it as relating to, many, many autoimmune diseases. And now we've seen it emerge and talking about intestinal permeability in the GI literature. And there are new kinds of tools, including a really cool one with the crazy name of confocal laser endomicroscopy, which means that they can go in with an endoscope that's got a microscope at the end of it. And it's a two-headed microscope, and they can look at the individual cells, and they can see different foods that will cause changes in permeability in individuals. And so it's not like just a conceptual thing. It's like, okay, we can see it physically. And so we see the emergence of this idea of, how to work with permeability. And, it's an important underlying aspect of dealing with autoimmune diseases such as ankylosing spondylitis. And I think it's part of in functional medicine, we focus on, sort of early clinical translation and what are the accelerables that are going to help us in the process. So we've been looking at the role of fish oil. We've been looking at issues of methylation. We've been looking at the talking about the gut microbiome for 30 years. Now it's, it's all in the literature and everyone's talking about it. And yet the thought leaders will say, well, it's still not ready for prime time. And I look at that and say, like, I've been using it as a tool for 30 years. The tool continues to be refined, but it already makes a difference. Helping leaky gut already makes a difference. And there are basic principles that we can use and apply. So we're not talking about something that is some voodoo from out of nowhere. We're talking about taking science, listening to what's happening in biology and in pathophysiology, and seeing how do these things relate. And that's a critical aspect of what functional medicine is doing, because it's not just trying to take, let me just take fish and throw it at this. Let me take B vitamins and throw it at this, or magnesium, but rather let's really understand what's happening with the individual, what the triggers are and where the imbalances are, and treat them in that way. And that's what you kind of did intuitively of bringing yourself into this process.
Yeah, and to touch on Dr. Fasano, because I think he so to summarize, or like to talk on that for a second, Dr. Fasano in the 90s, he discovered zonulin, and to me that was like the hard scientific breakthrough of, this isn't just like voodoo like you were saying. This is hard science. Like, we know that zonulin is a hormone in the gut that regulates the gut junction barrier. Like, this is not just like, oh, this could be placebo where you're not eating gluten and that's why you feel better. Like, no, like, we know gluten causes zonulin regulation. And so when I get a lot of because I'm on the internet, I talk with other evidence-based people. Yeah, I run into that crowd all the time where they say, if you're not celiac, then why are you avoiding gluten? It's only for celiac disease. And like, they just get on that and like, well, have you heard of zonulin? Like, this is a real thing. Sure, fine. We don't have large-scale, double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trials showing that ankylosing spondylitis is, the root cause AS is gluten. Fine, we aren't there yet. But what's the risk of experimenting with your diet, eliminating some things to see if you feel better? Like, we're not talking about getting surgery. We're not talking about doing these high-risk interventions. We're talking about temporary taking out and tweaking your diet to see, do you notice a difference? And so a lot of the what I see from my perspective, the evidence-based crowd on the internet, there's a certain bandwagon of zealots who are just like, they're so quote unquote evidence-based. They're the warriors who say, you're not celiac, why are you avoiding gluten? And so that camp, I tell them, like, look, we don't live in laboratories. We can't wait for double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trials of 1 million people to come out to confirm this hypothesis. Like, there's clinical evidence out there. You're a doctor. You have clinical evidence that this type of intervention works. It's low risk. Like, why aren't we just suggesting people try this out? It's not like they're believing in voodoo. They're just making small tweaks and see if you have a really major upside.
Right. The other piece in that is that they're also looking at, they're not looking at the literature that says 10 to 20% population may have gluten or non-celiac gluten sensitivity.
Yep.
And that's well described in the literature. And we know that from Fasano's work that the gluten is going to cause permeability issues. And so it may not be the cause of what's happening for you, but it clearly is a mitigating factor or a mediator of the process that's going on. So it's reasonable to be able to give that as a consideration for a trial. And I'm with you on that. I'm wondering, I don't know how much you've read of Dr. Fasano, but I in talking about how to deal with stress, I love his story, because what happened is he was an immunologist and gastroenterologist, and he was working on creating a vaccine for diphtheria.
Yep. I know the story.
So diphtheria, yeah, and what happened is that they identified, they made a vaccine to the particular diphtheria toxin, and it worked in rats, and so they started to give it in humans. It's a very small trial. In that setting, what they did is they were actually giving people diphtheria. They gave them the vaccine, and then they gave them diphtheria. Now you can die from diphtheria from becoming dehydrated, because it just causes a watery diarrhea. And so they did it, in the first 6 patients, and they all got sick. And he was just like, oh my God, what have I done? I made people sick. My work that I've done up to this date, it doesn't have any meaning. And, he said after spending a week of drowning his sorrows, he came back and he's like, why did that happen? Like, what's going on? Something else is happening there. And that led him to discover zonulin, which I think is such a great story of crisis and opportunity. And, like, we can see something, and it's like, if we just keep working and looking and using it as a tool to help us to be able to go forward, it helps us in our healing. And I think it's a great story. That's why I wanted to just share it, and then further validated all of what we've been talking about around intestinal permeability for the past 30 years.
Absolutely. We're coming up on time. We have less than 30 minutes left. So I'm going to just take a couple more questions. Um, Praise Treesus asks, you mentioned the importance of seeking out organic foods when possible. Why is eating organic important? And I'll also say one more thing contextually. I want to add one more thing to that, which is from a finance perspective, I kind of understand where it's coming from in that cost can be an issue too, in terms of, well, if I buy blueberry or organic blueberries versus regular blueberries, that's going to impact my bottom line financially. I don't know how sustainable this is. So that being said, sorry, go ahead.
So let's parse it out a little bit, because first, let's talk about local foods versus organic foods. And local foods are great. If you can eat local foods, go there. And then you want to look at the environmental working group and their dirty dozen and their clean 15. And so if you're taking something like a strawberry, which year over year is always considered the most toxic thing, like, don't eat inorganic strawberries because they're going to have pesticides on them, and you want to avoid that. Now, what we find is that with locally produced foods and with organic foods is that the mix of other kinds of bioflavonoids and polyphenols that are in there are much greater than the degree of other nutrients. Now, I'm not just talking about the carb fat protein ratio, or talking about the micronutrient that are present in them. We do see that in the standardized farming, there has been a loss of micronutrients in terms of minerals on the order of 35 to 70% over the past 50 years. That's looking at data from 1950 to 2000. And so we find that using other kinds of farming methods and looking at organic food, we do increase the nutritional richness and diversity of what is going on at that point in time. And so there's studies that demonstrate this, but we want to particularly highlight those things, the clean 15 and the dirty dozen, and really avoiding the dirty dozen, and that organics have been demonstrated in more recent studies to have a higher nutritional value. And so there, it's going to be a choice point along the way. How far do I want to go along that continuum? And when I also talked about the importance of eating wild or grass-fed and or organic meats and chicken, because toxins and pesticides and organotoxins, they what's the word? They bioaccumulate. So the higher we go up the food chain, the more in which they're going to accumulate. And so if we're looking at a chicken or a cow that is being fed, feedlot, or a farm-raised fish, they're going to be getting things that they're going to be exposed to increased toxins, and those are going to be in the food that we're eating. So doing the best we can to optimize organic foods and wild and organic meats in particular.
So I want to take a devil's advocate position here, because again, I hear a lot from the evidence-based crowd, and they have a certain their perspective, and their counter argument to what you said is they would point to, look, where's the evidence that pesticides are that bad for us? The government has done lots of studies on big scales showing that we can't see any direct impact from the pesticides. So therefore, it is such small doses, we're probably okay. We should be okay. What say you?
Well, I mean, we have over 2,000 pesticides and herbicides that are in circulation that have been approved by the FDA. And when they look at the individual things, they look at, okay, let's just look at this one and see what the dose is. That's okay. There have been no studies that have been looking at, well, how about if the two of them are together? Well, how about if 2,000 of them are together? What do we see there? Those studies haven't been done. Now, that doesn't mean that there's a problem, but it means that we actually don't have data on what the current situation.
You're breaking up right now. Could you repeat that last sentence? We don't have data on the current situation. That's the last thing I heard you say. It's getting a little bit choppy.
Something was just unstable. I got it. We don't have. Yeah, I just saw that. We don't have data on the current situation. It doesn't mean that it is wrong de facto, but we do need to be able to evaluate what's happening with the current situation. So a way in which I do that is I look at a simple liver marker called GGT, gamma glutamyl transferase, which is when it's elevated above 25, we see that there's an increased risk that it's associated with organotoxins, and it's associated with an increased risk of developing prediabetes, metabolic syndrome, and diabetes. So that seems like a useful thing to be able to focus on and then say, okay, now let's work to take that out of your diet and work with sauna and work with some other things to help you in the detoxification process of what's going on. And that's one of the things that I do and I work with patients around that. And so um, we want to be able to ask these questions and to be able to look at this and the presence of the persistent organic pollutants and what effect they have on disease. We can look at epidemiologic data of people who've been exposed to varying concentrations of, let's say glyphosate or of other kinds of herbicides and pesticides, and we can see that the disease rates increase in people who have closer proximity to those things. So now this is all epidemiologic data, and we don't have double-blind randomized controlled clinical trials to be able to do that. So we're doing our best because this stuff is already in circulation. And I think that from an evidence-based perspective, like, well, let's include this evidence in the conversation, because when I hear people say there's no evidence to support that, it's like, well, let's have a conversation and look at this evidence and say, well, how does this make sense? The proximity of increased illness, the presence of persistent organic pollutants, and the role of insulin resistance, or other inflammatory conditions. We do see correlations that are happening there. And I think we need to take them into account. And we do see that the decrease in the nutrient status of foods that have been conventionally raised, and we do see the increase in the amount of other nutrients that are present in organic foods. So this is all circumstantial data. I'm going to be clear about that. We're putting the pieces together, and it makes intuitive sense that we want to give the bodies the best things that are possible, and we got to weigh that against what the relative costs are. To be able to do that. That's why, I like the ewg.org delineation, because for some foods, it's not going to make a big difference. And for other foods, it's going to make a big difference. And again, buying local, work with a CSA, grow your own foods, that's going to be the best way.
So I want to go off of that a little bit in terms of talking about what's good enough. And is it safe to say, if I'm an average person listening to this, I'm trying to save money. And if I just try all organic for a couple of weeks, cut everything out, and I don't feel any difference between, like, let's just say, all my fruits, vegetables, meats, everything, for like a month, I spend the extra money on wild caught, local, grass fed. I go premium as much as possible. I don't feel any different. Then is it safe to say that I'm probably going to be okay if I just eat mostly inorganic, unfortunate, factory fed, all that kind of factory farm, that kind of stuff?
Well, the effects of chronic disease are due to chronic imbalances that are going on. So, I can't answer that question, and I don't expect that someone's going to see a change in their overall health status in a 1 month period of time of being able to do that. That's why I say incrementally approach it. The top of the food chain. Go with animal products that are going to be organic or wild, wild or grass fed first. As a means of being able to decrease your overall exposure, because it's the bioaccumulation, and then look at the clean 15 or look at the dirty dozen and say, okay, I should really pay attention to these. Like, those are simple ways to be able to do it, that can affect changes right away in your in your life.
Okay. It's speaking of the soil stuff, a question from Rob Boss is, have you prescribed any soil-based probiotics to your patients? Have you seen any success with them?
So there's a lot of hype around soil-based organisms at this point in time. The idea that we are what we eat is is important, and that we know clearly the immunologic effects of people playing in soil at a young age, and what Graham Rook put as the old friends hypothesis, and so there's value in the idea. There's actually no data yet on the soil-based organisms in terms of an effect on disease. So I'm data driven in my approach around probiotics, and I focus a lot more on prebiotics and foods that are going to help the beneficial bacteria to grow. And then when there's specific probiotics that help for specific disease states, and so we can talk about Bifidobacter infantis 35624 for IBS, or we can talk about VSL3 in a combination of, 3 strains of Lactobacillus, 4 species of Bifidobacter and Strep thermophilus at really high doses and its effect on ulcerative colitis. We can talk about what is the one Lactobacillus rhamnosus DSM 17938, something like that, and its effect on autism and behavioral changes. So I'm a big fan of probiotics to be able to use, but we're using them as medicines at that point in time. The global use of probiotics to be able to help with immune regulation, in theory, sounds great. In practice, has not yet been proven. So soil-based microorganisms, if we go to organizations that are selling them, we say, well, where's the data? And they'll show you some cell culture of human cells, or they'll show you some data from rats that say the rats don't have quite as many problems. That's interesting, but that's experimental. Now, if you want to use that to be able to go from, I believe that we are going to find that there are benefits. For instance, there's one out of Africa, out of Senegal, called Mycobacterium vaccae, that has been able to demonstrate some overall improvements in decreasing anxiety and decreasing fear-based reactivity. Pretty cool data out of the DoD. That's coming forward, but that's still in a very early phase of being able to do that. So have I prescribed? I've tried a few of them with patients, haven't seen any big benefit. Certainly not what's been promised. I think that it will come into the fore. I think there will be specific species and specific strains that will show specific therapeutic effects, and I'll continue to look at that. Jason Harlach, the probiotic advisor out of Tasmania, is one of the best people in terms of the data set that he has. Great person, most knowledgeable person on probiotics in the world, as far as I'm concerned. And he talks about it in a very similar way to which I'm talking about it here. ISAPP, the International Society for Advancement of Pre and Probiotics, another great website, and they've got some interesting tools to be able to look at and follow in terms of identifying which probiotics have which effects. But I'm gonna, on a clinical side right now, I don't use them clinically, soil-based organisms. And when I teach to doctors around the world, I share the exact data that I'm sharing right here. That is, maybe someday, not yet.
Okay, thank you. And speaking of clinical experience, Barrick has a question about your experience that you've seen with H. pylori, just unexpected symptoms that turned out to be related to H. pylori, and or treatment strategies.
Can you hear me okay? I just dropped my mic.
Yeah, it's okay. It happens.
All right.
Yeah, you sound good. You sound the same. So just treatment strategies and unexpected symptoms with H. pylori.
Yeah. Well, I want to come back and talk about H. pylori a little bit. So Helicobacter pylori, if we look at indigenous populations around the world, 100% of those populations have H. pylori. They're a part of the gut flora, in the upper gut, in the stomach, and they're quite common. And so the correlation that Dr. Marshall made in the 80s, where he was biopsying people who had peptic ulcer disease, and he found these present in a Western population in Australia, and he then isolated it and found that it was Helicobacter pylori, and then famously, took a potion of it himself and developed an ulcer, and went on and won the Nobel Prize for that work, Nobel Prize in medicine for that work that he did, demonstrating that it is a causative agent. However, we see that the vast majority of people who have H. pylori are not developing peptic ulcer disease. And so it begs the question of, well, just because it's there, does it need to be treated? And we know that there are a subset of H. pylori that are actually more pathogenic, bigger problem. And we don't have an assay yet to be able to determine or to be able to use that in clinical practice. It seems to relate to something called a KAG protein that injects a hole into the stomach that is from the H. pylori. So that's just giving you some background. Now I'm going to give you another piece of background that, when I was in my early 30s, I was working on Bering Sea with the Yupik Eskimo people. And it was well known that there was blood in the stool of just about every patient who we checked. And we didn't know why. And so we evaluated it, and we measured it in 200 people, found blood in everybody, and took the top 57 people and evaluated them with endoscopy, scoping from above, and colonoscopy. Did it with a group from the Mayo Clinic, Dr. David Ahlquist, who's published it in JAMA, and Dr. Ray Yip, who's working at the CDC. And what we found was that 56 out of 57 people had H. pylori, and that was the cause of their small amount of bleeding that was going on in their stomach. Now, none of them had peptic ulcer disease. We treated them all with triple therapy, which was the state of the art at that point in time. And we found that, at I believe it was a 3-month period of time, we had an eradication in about 80% of the population. But when they were tested again a year later, 100% had it again. So it's like, is it really a problem? And so I asked that question. So if I have someone who's got H. pylori and they're not having symptoms that are related to ulceration, I clinically am not automatically treating it, because I feel like the now quadruple therapy that we use, which includes a proton pump inhibitor and multiple antibiotics, is going to have an effect on the overall gut microbiome. And we find this paradoxical thing that when you treat H. pylori, the rates of GERD, the rates of reflux go up. So you reduce the H. pylori, and now you have more reflux symptoms that are going on. So I think that we're blaming the wrong thing at this point in time, and that it is a part of the normal flora. And in patients who have some degree or history of peptic ulcer disease who have it, definitely go ahead and treat it. I also want to say that that stool testing that looks at the DNA is not validated. Stool testing that looks at the specific antigen is validated, and breath testing is validated. And those are the tools that you use. But there are some stool tests that are out there from companies that are measuring lots of different things, and they measure the DNA. It has no relationship to actually having the antigen actively present in your stool. So that's sort of an extra side note on it. In terms of Baryshnikov, like, what are the symptoms that are going on? And so if they're GERD-like symptoms and you've got H. pylori, it's like, well, actually, if you treat it, those symptoms are probably going to get worse. So there's a dance around this, and then it goes to, well, how do I help the balance of the gut microbiome overall, and what's happening with my acid production? And I would come from a functional medicine standpoint and dig in and try to understand a little bit more about what's happening there. Now, if you're scoped and you find out that there's actually H. pylori there and there's some early ulceration, absolutely get treated. But it ends up being that, probably only about 15 to 20% of patients I see who have it do I recommend treatment for. And while I may be considered, just some, Twitch Yahoo doctor, who doesn't have any grounding, read the work of Dr. Marty Blazer, a GI doc at Columbia in New York, and his book called Missing Microbes, that talks about the alterations in the gut microbiome overall over the past 50 to 100 years. And he speaks a lot about H. pylori and says basically the same thing that I've just said here.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And we're pretty much out of time for questions. And so the final thing is, where can people find you? And do you take virtual consults?
I do. And we're booked up right now. We've gone to virtual consults, beginning in March. I much prefer and look forward to the time when I can at least see people in person, one-on-one for the first visit. But no, I do take virtual consults. My practice is called Family to Family. That's family to family, family to family. It's my wife and I. I'm actually in her treatment room at this point in time. So we see that she does some work with birthing, and we've got a papoose back here. And so I'm in her treatment room right at this point in time. Familytofamily.org in Asheville, North Carolina.
And what about, are you active on any social media platform in particular?
No, not at this point in time. We're working on it. It's more, a lot of my work has been focused on being able to do the research to validate the underpinning of the functional medicine model. As you said, I spent 5 years initially as medical director and then as research director at the Center for Functional Medicine at the Cleveland Clinic, and doing education of clinicians around the world through the Institute for Functional Medicine. And that's where my primary focus has been, rather than on building any personal brand, of rather trying to do the education and research that underpins the broader movement. So I do encourage people to check out the Institute for Functional Medicine and the work that they're doing, both broadly and as well as, while we've not talked about it, as recommendations as it relates to decreasing the severity of COVID and looking at vaccines and things of that nature as well at ifm.org. That's the place where I'm doing most of my work.
Yeah, if I can plug that for a second, actually, ifm.org, people can search for other functional medicine doctors there, right? And also, if you guys like Dr. Hanaway's stuff, go check out his other content that he's done out there, because he has a lot to say on COVID-19. I thought it was pretty great and thorough, the other stuff that I found. So if you guys are curious about his thoughts on COVID-19, go check that stuff out. It's hours of content. Well, Dr. Hanaway, this has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you for being here and spending so much time having this chat. I had a lot of fun. I hope you did too.
I did. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much for inviting me, and, great questions along the way. And I know when you said, well, we could talk for a long time, I'm like, well, really, but I kind of feel like we're still only scratching the surface. There's so many other kinds of questions and so many other places we can go. And I hope, if you want, that you invite me back in the future.
Oh, I would absolutely love it to have you back, because I could pick your brain for hours. There's so many questions, so many things I wanted to keep talking about. So we could probably make something happen, because I know there's definitely other topics that I'm sure you want, because you do the research. I can help you do the content and just give you a place to say, hey, this is some cool stuff coming out that we should draw more attention to. And I can, I would love to help facilitate that, because as a researcher, you may not be able to speak or get your message out there as much as you want to, right?
Yeah, it feels that way. And yet more and more people are finding this, and they're finding that it makes sense. When I explain this to other doctors, when I explain it to patients, they're like, well, that makes perfect sense. Like, isn't all medicine like that? Like, well, no, not right now, but we're working on it. Slow but sure.
Right. Sounds good. Once again, Dr. Hanaway, thank you again so much for your time here. I'm going to be listening to this podcast again to digest it, because it's so information dense. So once again, thank you and have a good day. If you like the content, comment and subscribe on YouTube. Also, follow us on Twitch and leave the notifications on. Feed your brain, feed your body, and see you next time.